Hello, and welcome to another special update from the William Branham Historical Research Podcast. I'm your host, John Collins, the author and founder of William Branham Historical Research at william-branham.org, and with me I have my co-host, researcher, minister, and friend, Charles Paisley, the founder of ChristianGospelChurch.org. And together we are trying to keep up with all of the information that's flooding in from Kenya, from this message cult commune where the pastor has enacted a mass suicide of several people. It's almost up to 100 confirmed dead at this point. And Charles, as I understand it, the authorities are getting involved in the situation, and they've now confiscated the land, and they're investigating into the activities of Mackenzie to show that he is promoting a radical belief system. And that belief system, as we know, is the message cult of William Branham. But specifically, it looks as though they have determined what you and I have already been explaining in our podcast about the political ideologies. The quote from the news here says that they are investigating to show that he has been promoting a radical belief system for the purpose of facilitating ideologically views based on violence to advance political, religious, and social change. So it appears the authorities are now understanding what this message cult is, and what this minister, Paul Mackenzie, what he was spreading in Kenya.
Yes, certainly as it relates to this iteration, and certainly as it relates to his sect, I mean, that is very true. You're right. The numbers continue to keep rising. I think the latest I saw was there's confirmed 89 deaths, which is up. The number of missing has more than doubled now. There's over 200 missing at this point. But on the good news, the number of people rescued has also increased, but only by one, unfortunately, since yesterday. But now up to 34 people have been rescued who were starving themselves to death. The authorities, you're right, have totally sealed off the 800 acres now and are continuing to comb that property. So I'm very, very thankful for the ones who have been saved, and I hope that more recover before it's over with. But you're right. You know, with analyzing this theology, John, there are certain things in those teachings. The only place that he could have possibly learned those things is through the message, right? I mean, they are very clear, very obvious message things. There's not another stream of Christianity that embraces these teachings. The only place he could have got these things was through the message. Serpent seed is one example. Again, I've just been looking through more of his sermons today, for example, and found, again, very, very clear indications that he's teaching serpent seed. And John, you and I both know serpent seed, the majority of people who believe serpent seed don't realize its origins in white supremacy. But inadvertently, whether they mean to or not, it actually ends up bringing about racial segregation and prevents interracial marriage when it's implemented. And it ultimately enforces segregation, right? Whether they're intentionally doing that or not, that is what it achieves. It achieves when it's implemented to its full extent, as it was taught in the message. It achieves racial segregation, and this was something that was done, as you and I believe and have exposed, through prior episodes on our podcast. It's something that was actually done covertly by ranking members of the Ku Klux Klan, starting in the 1950s and 60s, in order to create a watered-down version of racism so they could achieve segregation through religious practices as it began to be outlawed by the government in the United States.
Right. We've been getting a lot of questions about that on the website and in the comment feed. A lot of people don't understand that this was a religion rooted in white supremacy. And, the message sect, the message denomination, is spread globally, and there are a vast number of people in it who don't know that they were supposed to be racist, which is, when you take a step back, it's just really, really weird. There are a lot of people of color who are in this message faith. They don't know that they're in a religion that was literally created as a means to discriminate against the black man, black woman, black child. This thing was very racist, and the reason why it slipped under the radar is because William Branham took the very racially charged doctrine of Christian identity from Wesley Swift and he took the racial elements out of it and branded it as serpent seed. It's the same exact doctrine as Wesley Swift, but race is removed from it. And then he convinced his entire following, which was, at the time, it was quite large, that this was a divine revelation from God, this thing that he hijacked from, Wesley Swift. Once he convinced the people to believe this doctrine that had its roots in white supremacy, he then followed up with the hybriding doctrine. And the hybriding doctrine, if you take the racially charged elements of Wesley Swift's Christian identity and combine it with the serpent seed that William Branham taught, this is a very racially charged doctrine. The hybriding doctrine basically states that a black person and a white person cannot intermarry. If they do, according to William Branham, their offspring produces a quote-unquote mongrel, and that mongrel cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. And he says that for 10 generations, the offspring of the offspring of the offspring is evil. It cannot make it into heaven. So the race is brought into this doctrine through the hybriding doctrine. And this came up sometime in the past. There was a minister by the name of Donnie Reagan, and he was preaching the hybriding doctrine, the one that has the racial component. And he got branded as the most racist pastor in America by social media. And it went viral all over the nation. This was a problem because this was a very racially charged doctrine that he was bringing. Now, it's not his fault. He was, indoctrinated to believe this thing, and he himself probably does not even know that it is a racist doctrine. But its intent was to be racist, and that doctrine entered into mainstream theology through William Branham as covertly, to the extent where people are convinced to be racist and they don't even know that they are racist.
Here, this week, we've diverted somewhat from our typical pattern. So the normal pattern of our podcast is analyzing the history of this movement and the evolution of its doctrines and teachings. We don't generally deal with the modern state of this group. But these events that are happening here have caused us to start to do that. But if you want detailed analysis with explanation, with documentation of evidence of everything we're talking about, you only need to go back through our podcast series. There are lengthy episodes where we fully document everything as it relates to serpent seed, as it relates to Christian identity, and how this movement specifically emerged from those ideologies. I mean, it's all fully documented if you go back and look through our episodes, the episode on British Israelism, the episode on serpent seed, and the episode on racism in the message. If you check those out, I think that'll answer a lot of questions if you have those. And it's really interesting that this is happening right at this moment, because we are in the midst of a series of episodes where we have been examining the most horrendous cult splinter groups out of the message. We have been examining the connections between the message and Jim Jones, which are many. We've been examining the connections to Paul Schaefer. We're about to air episodes with the connections to Leo Mercer in the park. But William Branham and this theology has been connected to the majority of the worst Christian religious cults of the 20th century. Can all be linked in some fashion to William Branham, and this is no exception, right? This is an ideology that creates a framework where people can become radicalized around Doomsday. We take this group. What I've heard in the news about Paul Mackenzie is that he had told his followers that the Week of Daniel was basically going to start in August of this year, John, and that if they were still living then, they were all going to die torturous deaths, and the way to avoid it was to fast, and they had to fast themselves to death before August. That's what I've heard in some reports. The message goes through Doomsday event after Doomsday event after Doomsday event. This man is not the only man in the message who believes that this year is it, John. The sect of the message I come from, I could tell you churches across Africa and Canada, the United States, Australia, you all have the exact same belief that the Week of Daniel was going to start this year. And they're all still waiting. Now, will they all commit suicide when it don't happen? I don't believe so. But every time these events happen, that risk comes, right? And what happens is when that fails, they'll reset the date to something else, and then this risk repeats itself with each iteration. And with each iteration, they become more radical and more radical. And if someone will take the time to thoroughly analyze this stuff, you'll find this is not the first doomsday that this man has predicted. This is probably the 10th or the 12th, right? And they have gradually radicalized with each one. And it's very, very sad. But this is how this theology works. You know, where I come from, and the message has this baked into it. This is part of the very framework of it, that when the doomsday comes, there's some special thing that you're going to need from your leadership in order to make that final leg over, right? You're going to need the third pull. You're going to need the rapturing faith. You're going to need the revelation of the thunders, whatever it is. Every sect has their own little spin on it. And when they have convinced you that you reach the doomsday, the leader can feed you basically anything and tell you this is the final step to get you over to the other side. This is the thunders. This is the rapturing faith. This is the peace you need to finally make it to the other side. And that is baked right into the framework of this theology. And anyone who copies it can use that to create events like this. And it just repeats over and over, sadly. This is just a larger scale event happening right here.
Exactly. And the other comment that we've been getting is that William Branham himself, these people say, William Branham himself would have never condoned this sort of thing, these people fasting to their death. And, you know, those people just simply aren't aware of the history. As we mentioned in one of the previous updates that we gave, this thing was so tied to the latter rain movement and to the fasting, which was one of the fundamental components of the latter rain movement. And William Branham himself admitted on recording in 1956. Remember, 1956 is the same year that he began working with Jim Jones, Charles. And William Branham said on tape that there were people in the movement who were going insane from fasting. He mentions it. One instance was in January of 1956 in the sermon, The Intervale. He said, this man wrote a book on fasting. We know who he's talking about. He was touring with the man who wrote the book on fasting. And he's mentioning the women who went insane. And the thing that people don't understand, because when your mind is programmed with this sort of thing, you hear William Branham speak out against a problem, and you think, oh, he spoke against the problem, so he doesn't condone this. But if you carefully listen to what he said, William Branham was a master of double talk. He, in one breath, condemned the people who were still following, this fasting method, and then he introduced his own fasting method. He said, but in a real fast, you don't hunger, and you can go for days fasting without getting hungry. That's a God-given fast. I can't remember the phrase he used, but that's in the same breath. So what he's doing there is called double talk, double speak, where in the old westerns, Charles, the Indian would say, white man speak with forked tongue, because he's saying two different things at the same time. He is literally telling the people to do exactly what this Paul Mackenzie minister was doing, and he's condemning those who have, they fast and they go insane. He's actually condemning the victims in this. That's William Branham condemning the victims while still promoting the fasting.
Yeah, what you see in the message is, like you mentioned, William Branham, there is not a single topic that he taught consistently. No matter what you pick, he said it both ways. So you can justify literally almost any belief out of his teachings. You can find him opposing long fast. You can find him supporting long fast. And as you mentioned, Franklin Hall is the man who wrote The Atomic Power of Fasting. And Franklin Hall is the second person besides William Branham credited with starting this movement. William Branham and Franklin Hall are jointly credited as starting the latter rain movement. And Franklin Hall spent considerable time in Africa, John. I went back through the literature and the documentation just to re-verify that, but he spent considerable time in Africa, sharing his teachings right along in the same latter rain crowds, the latter rain groups and circles that William Branham traveled in and had set up. It was part of the same organization moving the latter rain teachings in there. So it moved along right with the whole thing. And so I don't think the average message believer would believe in fasting to death, right, under normal circumstances. I don't think any message believer would believe in fasting to death under normal circumstances. It's specifically the doomsday component that enables this, right? It's specifically the piece where they believe they've reached the doomsday, right? They believe in their theology as you read the stuff about Paul Mackenzie. They believe that the government is in the process of giving them the mark of the beast. That is what they believe. And that, in their theology, they believe we have reached the doomsday. This is it. And Paul Mackenzie has given them the peace they need to escape the wrath to come, right? And message framework enables that. And that's what I believe has got them there. How connected they are at the present to the core of the cult is hard to say. We're still waiting for more information from authorities. But certainly from the literature they've accumulated, John, they would have had to have been in direct contact with the core of the cult within the past 10 years, just by the look of that literature that they have, because some of it is that recent. Some of it's much older. Some of it dates from the 70s. But they have been in contact with the core of the message cult in recent years with absolute certainty based on the literature that they have access to.
Right.
Someone gave them that literature, right? And at this point, it's been nothing but crickets from message leaders here in Jeffersonville.
Well, it matches a pattern. In the past, we've had other people who were radicalized, and the cult did nothing about it. In fact, they suppressed the information. The vast majority of people in the cult have no idea that it's not just Paul Mackenzie. There are a number of men. And how many examples have we gone through now in our podcast, Charles? It's unbelievable the number of people that become radicalized by William Branham's sermons and transcripts of his sermons. Time and time again, it's not that this Paul Mackenzie is preaching 100% William Branham. It's that William Branham radicalized him, and he became a radicalized preacher who is now taking the worst aspects of what William Branham said. He's basically taking William Branham's worst thoughts and making them into a doctrine, just like all of the other radicalized preachers. And we've got lists of them on the website. These guys, once they become radicalized with this message, there is no telling what evil they will do. I mean, we've talked about some that are simply like the two guys in Canada. They became radicalized and they terrorized London, Ontario, just by screaming at the women with the way that they dressed or their hair, calling them prostitutes. That's kind of trivial. That's minor, although I'm sure the people in London didn't think so at the time. But on the other end of the scale, we have weapons of mass destruction. They're producing sarin gas. This is a horrific thing whenever a minister in this message cult becomes radicalized, because you don't know where they're going to go. Are they going to build weapons of mass destruction like they did in Colonia Dignidad? I don't know. Are they just going to terrorize people on the street? I don't know. But something bad will happen when they become radicalized. And that's what we see here with this Paul Mackenzie. He became radicalized. He became radicalized using William Branham's sermons, and then tragedy happened.
Right. And as you've mentioned, they're preaching a more watered down version of a less racial version of serpent seed there, it seems like. But there are black preachers in Africa preaching the fully racial version of serpent seed. Philippe Cacao in Ivory Coast has been arrested multiple times for preaching the fully racial version of serpent seed among Africans with many followers, right? So it's the full gamut of these beliefs are among message believers in Africa. And it's very sad. And what worries me, John, and part of the whole reason that I started working with you last year in order to put out this podcast is actually the present state of the message. William Branham's prophecies have largely been stretched just about as far as you can stretch them. They're to the point that you can't get much more play. The rubber band don't got much more stretch left into it. We're in the not just the last few numbers of years in which his doomsday prophecies can possibly in any plausible way work out. And what I fear, John, when I left the message myself, and what I fear in the coming months and years, John, is there is doomsday event after doomsday event after doomsday event scheduled throughout this cult, which is over 1 million people globally. And I am very afraid what is going to happen as each of these events fail over and over and over again. Like I said, there's doomsday events set from now up until the next number of years throughout all of these different sects. And you can't stretch. And most all of these, this is the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th iteration of those things where they've tried to recalculate, reorient after the previous ones failed. And they're right at the outer limits of what you can do with any of this stuff. And I really strongly fear what is going to happen because many of the older leaders right now from the early days of this are in their 80s, they're in their 90s. Some of them aren't even in their right minds anymore. And I fear that there is a very dangerous situation developing in this cult globally, I'm afraid. I'm just very concerned for them.
Right. You talked about stretching the doomsday predictions as far as you can stretch them. William Branham plagiarized the works of Clarence Larkin. He copied, the church ages. Branham taught this extra-biblical church age theology. Instead of the 7 churches of Asia, he taught 7 church ages of Asia. Well, he said that the last age, which was his, would be the very short one. And if you look at all of the dates that he gives for these alleged ages, we've now reached the point where if we even go into next year, we have now exceeded the first church age duration that he gave. So I'm expecting this is not going to be an uncommon thing that we're seeing here as these churches become more and more radicalized because either William Branham's prophecies failed and his divine revelations failed, or there has to be some event. And what we see with Paul Mackenzie is they just brought their own event. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's very tragic what's happening in Kenya, and it's very sad to see it happening, but we will keep you up to date as we get more information.